Welcome to the sixth video of this series on surviving IIM Ahmedabad, and the third one, which relates to academics. And this one's close to my heart because it's about being a CEO thrice a day, which is essentially that in IIM Ahmedabad we had 3 classes per day, and with the case study methodology, essentially there was a chance to be a decision maker uh, in every case, and that kind of was very empowering. But I think this phenomenon of case reading is not always well understood, which sort of limits the ability to really play this role effectively over and over again. So in this video I want to talk about how to read a case effectively. Now, I do not say that whatever I'm going to suggest in this video is the optimal way of doing things. I don't know if me or any of my friends was able to figure out an optimal. What I will present here is a way of doing it which I find is something which can work for many people because it kind of helped me make more sense of the cases I was reading. So before we get into the meat of the matter, like always, just glance over the next 4 slides which give context about where I'm coming from about these videos if you've not already done that. So maybe pause and read if you've not done this before. So yeah, now coming to the matter. So before I get into the deep dive, let me just describe what like a case study is. So it's can be of any length, like cases. There are cases which are 2 pages long versus there are 20 pages long, 40 pages long cases also. And it's roughly a description of a particular situation. So it's a snapshot in time of a particular company in a particular industry. And typically it will be written in some form of a story kind of a fashion. So that typically pretty engaging. And you will essentially not be told directly what you have to learn from it. But essentially, how it works is you read the case, you come to class, and the professor will discuss the case there. And through that case, key concepts will be taught. So the idea is that if you are just taught those things in class without a case, it might be difficult for an individual to relate the real life implication of what is being taught. So a case study helps with that. Most cases will have the story aspect to it, and then there'll be exhibits which are a mix of both numbers in many cases, and sometimes there are some descriptive facts also. So the main body and the exhibits. So this is broadly the case. And typically a case will have a protagonist or multiple protagonists, which are basically the people involved in that business situation. Now, that's the most interesting aspect I've already touched upon, that a chance to be that protagonist over and over again. And I think how it helps is that if we understand, if we observe ourselves while we are the decision maker thrice a day over our 2 years or at least over our first year, then we get a better understanding of our own style of management. I'll take an example. So let's say you're reading 10 cases, and in all of those cases, let's say a choice has to be made between solving the immediate problem or looking for a more sustainable solution. And as a decision maker, you have to decide. And it's a very real thing, right? Whether you invest in the short term survival of the company or whether you take a bet that the company will survive in the short term and you invest more in sustainable solutions. So you do that, you find 10 such cases, and every time you find that you're the kind of person who focuses on the short term rather than the long run. So if you observe yourself, you will get a better understanding that, hey, if I was actually in that life situation later on, I will probably always focus on the short term, which might not be the optimal decision, right? Because there clearly is a bias in my thinking. If I was picking long term, short term, mix of that, depending upon the context, then I can still say that I'm giving more focus on the context. But if every time I'm picking short term, then clearly that's a inclination that I have. And this has implications for how I go about managing my affairs later on. It can also help me understand because I understand my limitation, I can form better teams in the future. Let's say I'm starting up tomorrow and I know that, let's say in this universe, there's only one parameter. Now, given I am a short-term thinker, I might want to have someone who has a, let's say, more long-term thinking, or vice versa. If I am a long-term person, I would want someone who's a short-term thinker, so the team overall is balanced. So whatever decisions you take are your decisions to take, but it's very crucial to have a better knowledge about your own self. And I think the case study method, and more uh, importantly, observing yourself how you take decisions, helps you do that. So that's a bit on the introduction front of it. Now I think again I'll break this down into three parts: the pre-class, the during class aspect, and the post-class aspect. And I mean, 90% of the work here is with pre-class. I've already mentioned it's written in the form of a story, but I think the risk is of reading it like a story. What I would strongly suggest is that it should be read when you like peak concentration. It's possible to skip through case, and in probably very limited amount of time, 15-20 minutes. I've seen a lot of people do that. uh, just like flip through the pages, and if you can't read it, at least flip through the pages. That's still better than not reading it at all. But given a choice, spend your uh, peak concentration on that and read the case not like a story and just let it wash over you, but do it with a mindset of either fault finding or appreciation. Because in the end you will realize it more in the class. This is what is being focused on: either you will be taught that the company did something right, or you'll be taught that the company did something wrong. Now, one more aspect which makes it even more fascinating is, let's say you're doing the fault finding. Let's say in a particular case you find that there are 10 faults. But in the class, the professor only finds out 4. Now, you've not just learned about 4 things that are fault, and the prof will talk about the associated learning aspect. What you've also learned is that there are 6 other things that you were actually slightly misguided, or you would say you were not completely uh, your learning was incomplete on that front because you mislabeled those 6 things as also as faults. So by doing that, you will also get a understanding up and beyond what is being discussed about in the class of your own business, your level of business understanding. And you can take these 6 things and try to understand it in the class itself. Like I mentioned, like raise it as a class participation point, or go to the professor after the class that you found this as a fault. Why is this not a fault? So you get more ideas to discuss. So that's very important of the mindset you have while reading a case. The second is cover to cover reading, including exhibits. In some cases that might not be possible because the exhibits are also pretty long. And if you're crunched for time, find just reading the body of the text is perhaps more important than sometimes the exhibits. But what I found is that without the exhibits, I mean, the case just feels incomplete. Story is fine, but the exhibits give you the background, it gives you so much more knowledge. So I think reading the exhibit helps from the case perspective itself. It really gives you more context in the case. And if you want to actually go about fault finding, the body of the case itself might not have a lot of numbers, but the exhibits probably will. And typically you try to find points of deviation in all the exhibits to actually zero in on what the problem is. So without reading the exhibits, you have only a limited appreciation of the problem in most cases. So do read the exhibits and try to see if the numbers make sense or not. I mean, read them with some amount of focus that hey, this should tie in together. The second aspect why I like reading exhibits and why I find them useful is because just from a knowledge perspective, right? You get to know more. Let's say if you're doing a case about the steel industry, the exhibit will typically give you the structure of the industry, who are the major players, what everyone is doing. A lot of things will be there. So while you are reading the case about a particular company, the exhibits will allow you to have a richer understanding of the entire context of the entire industry in which the case is located. So just from a knowledge perspective, also the exhibits are pretty helpful. So I think do read the exhibits from these two aspects. These two are covered. Then the third thing is cases. Typically, like I mentioned, there are snapshots in a particular time frame, right? And some of the cases might be dated. They are written 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years down the line ago. It might be a great idea to research what happened to that particular firm and where is it now. Because what I feel, and that's how I used to interpret the situation is, let's say this is where the company was when the case was written, and this is where the company is, assuming it exists. So what the prof essentially tries to do is essentially build a bridge between this point and this point. So the learning is to show that the company did something right or did something wrong and has to rectify to actually go on this path of development to reach where it is today. If you have not, if you do not know what the end point is, you do not know where the company is in the present time, then when the prof is telling you about the fundamentals, one can get a little lost because you do not see the end point of where this discussion is going. You have the starting point, but you do not have the end point. This point might feel a little hard to relate to, right? But imagine a discussion. If you know where the discussion is going to culminate, it's easier to follow that discussion. And this is very similar to it's similar to the logic I'm trying to build here. So research what happened to the firm. It also gives you a chance to figure out whether what the professor is saying makes sense or not and raise your questions if that's the case. So have a complete understanding of what the case is talking about and do some bit of research of where the company is right now so that the journey thereof makes sense to you. Some of the cases have questions associated with them. If there are, then do think about them, spend time, discuss it with your friends, and solve those questions and take a decision. Be the decision maker and figure out very, very clearly. Do not do this superficially. Imagine it to be as real as possible and take a decision. Because, like I mentioned initially, that will give you a very iteratively, it will give you a clearer sense of who you are as a person and as a business leader. And finally, if you do all of this, if you have fault finding, if you read the exhibitions well, if you undo your research, and if you take a decision, you will have a bunch of questions. So one part of the problem of what to ask and what is a relevant thing to ask, like when I mentioned about the class participation, I mentioned that sometimes people do not ask relevant things. But I feel that, especially if I look at my own experiences, when I've done all of these things properly, in those classes, the questions that I asked, I think those are, that really helped take the discussion forward within the class. And in the lectures where I had skipped on, because again, this was not something which was given to me, I would not follow the process always initially. So in the classes where I was not following this kind of process, my questions were all over the place sometimes. So take the list of questions to class. This would be a pre-class aspect to it. Then there's basically one thing to do when you enter the class, which is to ask a question and discuss till your intellectual curiosity is satisfied. This is where your fault finding, your research, all of this will come in handy. Because not only can you ask a question, which is the fault finding aspect of it, your research will give you more ammunition, more facts to back up that question. Because you know that this company has gone from point A to point B. And if something in that journey does not make sense to you, you can ask a very directed question. So go out and discuss the case during and after the class with the professor. And then the last aspect is, what do you do when the day essentially ends, when your academic part of the day ends, at least the classroom part of it. Spend 5 to 7 minutes just revising what's been discussed. This is so crucial because initially you went to class with questions, and in the class in real time, a lot of answers were thrown at you. Sometimes, at least I found it difficult to match the questions and the answers perfectly within the class. So give yourself 5 to 7 minutes when you come back to map this out to see whether the answers and the questions match up. If they do, great. You can make a compilation of your key learnings at a place and just store it if you want to revisit it later. And if you find that there is still this lack of coherence between the questions and the answers, then you have something to go back to the professor to, either over email or in person later. So, I mean, just doing this pre-class, during class, and post-class aspect, I think it really increase the amount of learning that one can have from this case study method. And at the end of the day, the case study method is something which, at least at IIM Ahmedabad, we were told is one of the best methods to teach this kind of, to have this kind of learning. And I think if one follows this process, the learning is significantly more. So I hope you can also follow this and this adds to your learning in a meaningful manner. And as always, I'll just leave with a few points that keep revisiting this and share it with someone that you find would benefit from this. uh, Let me know if this has been helpful for you, and check out some of the other videos on this YouTube channel. So just take care, best of luck, and stay curious.